13 acres. We went from 900, high 900s to 13, so that's a big difference. And on my farm, I swear we were at least 3 bucks per doe. How I put it together, is pretty fascinating too. I mean, it was, like I said, it was more like a gift from God that just said, here, you know, this doesn't work very often, but it's going to work for you this time around. And I remember thinking, you know, there aren't any does left on this farm. It was, and there were, but that was pretty typical then. You would just see massive numbers of bucks. On last week's episode, I talked about the fact that we sold our farm during the off season, and I'll talk about why and what the plan is real quick. But in the rest of the episode this week, I'm going to talk about how we put that place together over the first 4 or 5 years of living there, 6 years, and then the management strategies that I used over the 18 total years that we lived there and owned that property. So now for the why part. Well, the simple reason is because somebody came along that wanted to buy it. I mean, you're not going to sell something if you don't have a buyer, but it wasn't actually for sale. We knew that at some point I had a desire to get back to where I grew up, to spend most of my time hunting closer to my family. You know, my parents are getting older. I don't see them nearly enough. So I thought, well, if I'm sitting, 4+ hours away doing most of my hunting, all my management, all this, time spent there, it'd be a lot better if I own something right close to them than all the time that I'm there hunting and all the time that I'm, working on the farm. I can be close to mom and dad and the rest of my family. So I'm 4 generations deep on both sides of my family up in Northeast Iowa. So if anybody's been there for more than 2 or 3 generations, I'm probably related to them. So I have this really wide net. A lot of people that I know, a lot of contacts up there, a lot of family and distant family. And I thought it'd be pretty easy to sell our farm and just roll up there and find somebody that would be willing to sell me something that was at least reasonably comparable. But that wasn't the case. There's a difference between wanting to buy something and somebody wanting to sell it. So I did look at a lot of different properties that appealed to me, stuff that I had some history with over the years from hunting there, as a boy, and just beautiful areas, and narrowed it down to a couple of really good candidates. And I thought I had both of those I thought were gonna move in my direction, but they didn't. In the end, the people who owned it just decided they didn't want to sell. So I'm gonna be hunting on a lease up in Northeast Iowa, and I've got permission up there. Like I said, there's lots of people that I know, and it wouldn't be hard to find more places to hunt. So it's not about finding places to hunt. It's really about trying to get back to owning a really prime piece of whitetail land. So that's where I'm at. We live on 13 acres now. We own 13 acres. We went from 900, high 900s to 13. So that's a big difference. But the lease is pretty good size, so that'll be fun. I can spread my wings and stretch out there. So that's where I'm at as far as going into this season. I'm not sure how much I'm going to contribute. It won't be obviously as consistently as it was in the past, where I could just step out my back door. We could go do a project. I could go jump into the tree for a couple hours and try to shoot a doe, and the camera guy was, right there. This is a lot different because now it has to be planned, and I have to drive to the locations and so forth. So I hope to be as active, or at least somewhat active, but it won't be as much as it has been in the past. But there's a lot of great contributors to Midwest Whitetail. I mean, there's plenty of people to fill that, that gap that I might leave not contributing as much. So now let's get on to the meat of this and talk about how I put that farm together and what I've done with it after I bought it. I started with 125 acres, and a guy named Larry Kendall sold that to me. And if that name is familiar, Larry actually started Muddy Outdoors, the tree stand company. And he owned and started the Bloodsport Arrow Company, and he just lived a little ways down the road, after he sold it to us, and we became great friends. But anyway, we bought it from Larry. There was no realtor in there, and then little by little, I owned some other land that I sold and bought pieces that bordered me, just talking to neighbors, and they just started selling me land. And I wasn't pushing real hard, but I was throwing it out there. If you're interested, let me know. And at the time, I was buying it at about a 10% to 15% premium to the market. So that was the encouragement to get them to sell. And the challenge for me, of course, was to figure out how to pay for it, because it wasn't like I was making a whole bunch of money. So it was all about, playing with the bank's money. I would purchase other pieces of property someplace else and, sell those and do a 1031 tax exchange and roll in. And, just little by little, I was able to piece it together with a pretty minimal income. But you got to remember, back in the early 2000s, land wasn't anywhere near as expensive as it is now. So I was buying land, probably about 1/3 of the cost of what it is now, roughly in that range. So it was a lot more affordable, but still I didn't have the income really to support that. So I had to do a lot of these little transactions here and there and make some money here, roll that back in. I got lucky, God blessed me in the effort, and I was able to put it together. We moved there in 2002, 125 acres, and I think it was 2007 when I bought the last piece. So it took 5 years, 6 years to put the whole thing together. But that's how I did it. And once I had my hands on it, well, the first thing is I looked for that neighborhood specifically. I mean, I knew a little bit about it. I knew that area pretty well. So I was targeting that area, and I targeted specifically those farms because they had that really nice mix of open and habitat. So on that property, I was probably 75 to 80% cover. And the rest of it was, in theory it was tillable. A lot of it was too small. The fields were too small to really be considered farm fields. They became food plots once I acquired the land. But, they were considered tillable acres when I bought it. There was some CRP on there and so forth, but anyway, you get the gist of it. I was really looking for that formula in that 75%, habitat to open. And I like that in the Midwest for a lot of different reasons, and maybe someday we can talk more about that. But so that was the farm, putting it together. The first thing I ran into was some problems with the farmer neighbors. And these were all people, for the most part, that I already knew. I knew the neighborhood fairly well. And they were pretty disappointed in the amount of crop damage that they were getting. And of course, the farm that I bought, I was new to it, so it wasn't really my fault, but I had to figure out some way to knock back the deer numbers. And there's a long story to it, but I ended up putting together some meetings with the DNR, and we found a way to open up the quota system, and they did it statewide, but it was more, I think, motivated by our situation down there. They opened up the quota system so that we could kill more than just a couple of does every season. So we went hog wild, my neighbors, myself, my guests, and I think that first year they opened it up, we killed 50 some does on what would have been 600 acres at that time. And we kept that process up for a few years. We were trying to get ahead of it, trying to get our farmer neighbors, to, at an acceptable level of crop damage. And I think after about 3 years, we really did get there. And it was almost all bow hunting. Some of my neighbors would come in and do some gun hunting on there and shoot some does. And, I let them do deer drives for a few years just to shoot does and clean out as many as we could. And it was a pretty heavy-handed approach to trying to bring the numbers down. But I think the most interesting thing in that whole process, and this is what I really want to talk about for a couple of minutes, is we flipped the buck to doe ratio in that whole neighborhood, but specifically on my land, very significantly. A normal Iowa herd is probably 2 does per buck, maybe 3 does per buck in areas that are overpopulated. We got it flipped, and on my farm, I swear we were at least 3 bucks per doe. So it was completely opposite. We had way more bucks than does. And the first thing that people assume is that all of these bucks are going to leave the farm during the rut. They're going to go looking for does someplace else. They're not going to be there. But you got to keep in mind that deer don't have these communication systems that we have. They don't know that 2 miles away there's a whole bunch of does. You know, all they know is what goes on within their normal range. They don't have that capacity to think outside of what's, you know, around them. And there may be individuals that do, but for the most part, the bucks didn't leave. You know, they stayed within their normal range. They just traveled more. So we didn't have a lull in the rut like we typically do now, where we have during the middle of November, you know, about a week to 10 days there where the activity slows way down because the bucks are all tied up with does. So there weren't that many does, so they continued to cruise right on through. And we were having great hunts right through the middle of November. I killed a really nice buck on the 16th, I remember, that was out cruising. And you know, since then, and as the populations have come back, you know, the doe numbers have come back, you know, I don't see that kind of movement anymore. So anyway, that was a significant takeaway. They don't leave, they travel more. So that was pretty cool. The other one was, you know, nature abhors a vacuum. You've heard that said before. So the other farms around our neighborhood were net exporters of bucks, and we were net importers, because the animals that disperse from a high population area are going to be the bucks. The does typically don't disperse. They stay in their family groups. They just keep getting, like, piling up on top of each other, whereas the bucks will move out and they'll get outside of that concentration area. Well, we were in that vacuum. So not only were we bringing the population, you know, the doe numbers down and leaving the buck numbers high, we were importing bucks from outside of our area where the population density was even higher. So it was pretty crazy there for a while. I mean, I remember, gosh, it was probably 2005 or 6. I sat on a field and I counted them, I had 27 2.5-year-old bucks. I'm not kidding, I don't know, there might have been a couple other, you know, 1.5 years or maybe the odd 3-year-old or something in there, come out into one little, like, 1.5 acre corner of that field. And I remember thinking, you know, there aren't any does left on this farm. It was, and there, I mean, there were, but that was pretty typical then. You would just see massive numbers of bucks. Well, the hunting was really cool for a while, but, you know, it wasn't sustainable because we started to get into, you know, more of a downward trend in the deer numbers. And the neighborhood, you know, continued to shoot, you know, lots of does. And then that was probably okay. And then the EHD in 2012 just took the legs out from under us. So we were doing really good. I mean, 2011 was fabulous on the farm. We just had big deer everywhere. It was the best I've ever seen, any place I've ever hunted free range. So that was really interesting. 2012 EHD came and just kind of crushed everything. And then we fought back, you know, little by little, year by year. And we had taken the population to that point where it was mostly bucks. You know, maybe at that point, maybe, you know, 2/3 bucks on the property. So the bucks were more susceptible to EHD. We lost probably 80% of our bucks in 2012. And then it just went into this kind of a desert period where we had really poor hunting for several years. You know, there was a couple of survivors that we cleaned up in 13, maybe, I don't know if I killed anything in 14 and 15. You know, back to 16, we're starting to get numbers back again, some decent bucks. So it took a while. I mean, it takes, you know, 5 years to grow a 5-year-old buck, you know, so it takes a good while to recover from EHD. So that's kind of the herd dynamic. You know, I'm sure I've probably talked enough now that I've worn you out on this stuff, but there's so much to talk about. I mean, I could go for hours, you know, especially on the management stuff. I mean, one of the things I thought was really significant was you can increase the holding capacity of your property by doing the timber stand improvement, by creating more browse, creating more thick cover back in the habitat or in the trees. Make that thicker, create browse. The deer will feed in the timber a lot more. You can carry more deer. The bucks aren't like looking at each other all the time like they are if they're coming out in the open and feeding in the little clover fields. I believe they tolerate each other at maybe a little bit higher density than they would if they were interacting all the time. As the timber on my farm started to mature from the cuttings that we did, we started in 2003 and we just whacked away at it, and it took about 5 years. We went through the whole, you know, basically 750 acres of timber on that farm. We did the TSI on all of it, and as it started to mature over the years after that, you could see the amount of shifting from the deer feeding in the cover, in the browse, to focusing on the ag fields and food plots. So I believe that's super important. I think if you're really trying to maximize the overall carrying capacity of bucks on your property, the health of the animals, and have a good balance between them feeding on your food plots and ag fields and leaving them alone to grow, you need to do the timber stand improvement and create that browse back in the timber where they're going to spend more time feeding rather than, like I said, focus 100% just mowing down your crop fields or your food plots. That was pretty key stuff. Another thing that I think we really learned over the years was the value of these tiny little, we called them poor man plots. And I came to start calling them staging area food plots because they were areas close to bedding, and the deer would come out, hit these little small patches. A lot of them were just created out of natural openings. And these little staging area plots would be the first place you'd find those bucks on their feet in the evenings, and the last place you'd find them on their feet in the mornings. So I spent a lot of time creating and hunting those spots. That was another really good lesson, I think, from the 18 years of owning that place, was that I could make it a lot more huntable with a bow because these spots are small. The shot opportunities that you get are pretty close range. It makes a lot of sense. You can get in and out of those places really easy because the deer don't linger there. So that's kind of the gist of the big picture stuff. And like I said, I'd be happy someday to just talk for hours about what I learned there. It was a really good template, a really good place to figure out what works and what doesn't. And I think the guy that bought it probably doesn't realize that he bought a mowed tee box with a golf ball sitting on the tee, because the stuff that I've looked at to try to replace it, I haven't found anything that's even close to as good from that standpoint. From the management side, I just walk around and I look at these farms and I think, oh man, there's just so much that has to be done here. So there is a lot you can do, and it's fun stuff. It's fun work. I had a lot of fun over the years creating this place, and now I'm going to move on, and ideally I'm going to find something else to put my stamp on over the next few months here, hopefully, or however long it takes. I'll keep looking. So that's my story of why we sold, how I put it together. How I put it together is pretty fascinating too. I mean, it was, like I said, it was more like a gift from God that just said, here, this doesn't work very often, but it's going to work for you this time around. So that was pretty cool too, just to watch all the pieces fall into place, that I was able to purchase that much land. And then the management side of it, all the stuff we learned, even the neighborhood dynamics of working with the farmers and trying to come up with a way, through the DNR to give us the tools we needed, to keep the deer from overcrowding their fields. Next week, I'm going to come back and talk about some of the best hunts that I've had on that farm over the years. And there have been some really, really good ones. I went back and looked, and we've killed 10 bucks over 180. Myself, family, or guests, we've killed 10 bucks over 180 in the 18 years that I owned that place. And there was some, of course, that got away too, that those memories aren't quite as good, but probably more valuable. So there's been a lot of cool stuff that happened there. Some really big deer, a lot of really fun encounters, learning experiences. I'm going to touch on that next week. So hopefully I didn't drag this too long and wear you out on this topic. I won't talk about it again. I'm going to move on. After these 2 episodes, you're not going to hear me talking about what happened, last year. We're going to move on to what we're doing now. So hopefully you enjoyed it. We'll see you right back here again next week for the next episode of Midwest Whitetail. And remember to always dream big.